There we go. Sorry, recap. Thank you for joining us. We're going to talk tonight about healing trauma through your brain and the polyvagal system. And I'm Dr. Kristen Zawada at Monarch Family Chiropractic, and we're excited to get started on this topic. This is one that people ask us about all the time. We try to cover it a couple times a year in our workshops, and there is so much of this topic we could do an entire month series on it. And there'll be a few other workshops that probably play into what you do when you maybe have experienced trauma, when you see trauma in your world and how it shows up and how your nervous system presents. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, is you seeing and being able to recognize that and maybe be able to see where you fall in the body's level of traumas or how it stores it. And if you're storing, sorry, give me 1 second. Screen to go to the next slide. What it's doing. Okay. Now I'm getting the boxes. There we go. Sorry, guys, I wasn't there a second ago. So we're going to talk about the understanding of really brain development. And just so you understand and hear these terms and have some context to them. I'm not going to deep dive in anatomy and all of that, which we could easily do. But when we talk about brain development, so we understand how things work and where they come from, we're talking about because our brain processes things differently, and different parts of our brain do different types of our understanding, our sensation, our feeling, how we process emotion versus other areas that are just very A plus B equals C based, I guess, is just the doing of our brains. So the ventral vagal is the part of our vagus system in our nervous system that really is doing all the involuntary functions. So actions in our face and what we hear, and certain functions related to that, including heart and lungs, things that we're not even thinking about that are running for us and functioning for us every second of every day. The sympathetic part of the nervous system is really the organ systems that operate that smooth muscles during all of our daytime, activities, any immobilization. So all of our, like with movement, hangs out more in the torso area of our bodies, and is really responsible for that fight or flight response. We'll dive into this a little deeper as we go. So just covering some terms. And the dorsal vagal is the part of the parasympathetic, which is that calming part of the nervous system, right? So the yin and the yang, the opposite of that sympathetic in a way. So all baseline survival functions function from this part of the nervous system. So again, there's a crossover. It is also doing heart, lung, digestion, reproduction. No matter what else is going on, it's the baseline survival functions our body needs, no matter what state it's in. Let's see if I can just tap. Lost a screen. There we go. So going back to before we dive into that, a lot of things around if our systems are on overload, or we may have had traumas or emotional things or different situations that create us to be in a state, an autonomic state, whatever that is really good to know that your autonomic state is self-reinforcing. Meaning, if you feel safe, you sense more safety. If you feel threatened, then that holds true as well. You may feel more threats. So it's a matter of when our brains are processing, do we feel safe in, and you fill in the blank, right? In all situations. So how our body responds to something is again exactly that. The physiology is a response to our environment. So again, if we feel like we're in a safe safe zone, then our body and our nervous system and our physiology presents that way. So your brain is determining that safety or that threat, not necessarily, your body or the other components of what's going on. And we'll dive deeper into that, where emotion plays into the parts of the brain and where it doesn't. And hopefully that'll help make sense of what drives that is really the brain, not your environment. So, and going into a way to look at those things is kind of like a green, red, yellow type light. It's more of where is our state of mind? Where is our brain versus what's happening in our environment, and how do those cross over? So here's kind of breaking those three components down that we did for your autonomic state. You're either in that ventral vagal, the sympathetic, or that dorsal vagal. And when you sense more threat and you aren't at a place to be able to handle it, you're going to be in that dorsal vagal. That, place where there's a severe threat or a lot of danger. Now, if it's something that's not that, I guess, mortal, just to take that word out of it, and looking at, we run in that sympathetic or hopefully that ventral vagal a lot, and you're bouncing between the two. When you're in that ventral vagal, there is more of that sense of safety. And it's not that it's unsafe, but a sympathetic might be, I've got to handle a thing, deal with an event, a moment, and hopefully it's just short-lived. And so there may be a danger or a threat, but it's not something that has changed our whole perception on that thing, right? Or where we are handling that thing. So it's kind of that yellow of like, yes, we slow down, we're out of maybe what feels safe, but we are not in a place of feeling mortal danger either. So our body reacts and needs to react, but it doesn't need to shut down into a life-threatening state. Okay, so there we go. Now we're back to mouse working. So what we know, there are a few phenomenal researchers in these topics. And I think it's really pertinent that we understand how much this is studied, but knowing that just reading, a couple of these researchers that have been doing this work for decades, it started a lot of ways around mental health, and it's evolving into how we need to use it in our day-to-day. But how traumas work in the brain and what really helps us work through them in the most efficient way and in a way that feels like someone wants to work through them. So again, as we get to that, there's a lot of quotes that I just pulled a few good ones from a few different authors and researchers, but trauma is really, it's compromising our ability to engage with others, right? It's replacing patterns of connection with patterns of protection. So when you're in our office, you always hear us say, you can't be growing, like healing and being in protection and connection at the same time. It's like you're kind of doing one or the other in a lot of ways, right? It's hard to heal when you're not in a state of feeling safe or in a place where your body can, shut down and relax and go into more of those healing parts of the nervous system. Another one I thought that was really interesting, and a lot of this has come up through COVID and times of watching how people got so disconnected or just felt disconnected because they weren't in their regular patterns, they weren't with their regular people, they weren't feel the same connections that our brains and our as humans need in order to thrive. So we're seeing a lot of things a year and a half, 2 years later, where people's systems are in a state of that dorsal shutdown of just in a sense feeling very like unsafe or unable to connect to where our brains think an environment is, again, not necessarily life or death, but no longer giving us joy, no longer making us feel, happy or fulfilled. So this statement, as far as through the history of humanity, when humans are threatened, mitigate to a threat response through social interaction. So through being hugged, through being with a trusted individual, right? We put ourselves around things that make us feel safer or people that we can trust. So there's a lot of that public health mandating the impact on how it's imperative that we are connected and imperative that we are connecting. So it shifts our autonomic nervous system that we were just covering, those three parts, into a state of defense, right? Into a state of fight or flight. Well, that's not where healing is happening and optimal health happens in that state. So we want to get out of that state and get back into a calmer state. So you're going to see me reference a bunch of slides by Dr. Monique Andrews. She is amazing, to say the least. Some of the research and who she follows, and over her 30-year plus, she is neuroscientist. She became so intrigued with how the brain is doing all of this work, and that there's so little happening, and that it's not coming and being derived from other parts of our bodies and our external states, that when she saw the kind of work that was transforming with the work we do as chiropractors, she became one. So she has all this decades of neuroscience and neurobiology behind her, became a chiropractor, and then taking that practice into how do we teach people how much their brain and their nervous system is really what allows their body to be, and to make any changes to it. So Vanderhoek is somebody she references a lot, and that's her picture up in the corner when she was teaching us about polyvagal and the nervous system in this manner. So she talks about how she references a lot of his work with, no matter how much insight and understanding we develop, the rational brain is basically impotent to talk the emotional brain out of what its own reality is. So the rational will talk ourselves out of the emotional. And it's really what is real and what does reality seem like, and where is that coming from? So here's where we kind of explain that component. So she goes through the whole neurobiology of trauma. And I thought that this was such an awesome slide because, again, it just takes a lot of headiness and a lot of science, and hopefully makes it make sense by compartmentalizing how our brain works and how our bodies are going through processing things in our nervous system. So when we have a normal state mode of trauma, or something that sets us off, or something that's an immediate threat, the process our brains do is we have that experience of the stressful event, and it sets off an alarm. So it's kind of like how she calls the amygdala there, which is the smoke detector part of the brain. And that is what its job is. And that is the part that's kind of tucked very centered behind the eyeballs there. That's really a big part of like all its job is. But that's where we present or experience the fear. Then the response is to do something. So we, I mean, they used to use the example of like being chased by a tiger, right? That's what cavemen had to worry about. It was just like hunting, gathering, like the fear was short-lived. Like you were either being chased by the tiger or the bear, or you were chasing them, right? For their next meal. So there was immediate threats, but then the situation would resolve. You do something about that threat, and your body then does a discharge of literally, shaking it off, like letting it go, like your body comes out of that state and comes back into a calmer state. So we just tend to live in a world where we don't live in a very calm world, and there's a lot of chaos and outside noise, right? That can definitely be creating a lot of flags to go off or alarms to go off in our brain and how our body perceives those. So the watchtower is that area where it's that executive function. It's regulating thought and how we're processing things. So discharge, the best way I could explain it is that it's like when you watch a dog being done playing or doing its thing, and having dogs my entire life, it's just very relatable, where they literally finish something, right? And what do? They walk off and they shake. They just will do a full body shake. And it's a very similar thing that our brain does to say, okay, I'm done with that experience, or I'm done with that thing, and I've processed through that thing. So if we're doing something about that, we've processed it. The discharge is like literally a shaking off kind of concept. And then we move on to the next thing. If we get too aroused, if the brain gets too stimulated, if it gets too much trauma, it gets stuck. So it's like then becomes a chain reaction of getting like kind of stuck in a feedback loop. So why does it do that? It's a survival mechanism, right? We're trying to survive and protect ourselves against whatever the thing is that feels like the threat. So when it happens a lot, or we can't shake it off, we tend to go into, it doesn't have to necessarily be horrific thing. It just, can we, in a sense, bounce back from it? Can we process it in our brain and understand that it was a threat? We did something about it and we discharged it. So then what happens is you get a nervous system that's just on this loop, right? Of overwhelm, overwhelm, overwhelm. It's never discharging. It's never dropping out of that threat, if you will. So we then drop into the emotion component of our nervous system. And that's happening in that executive function area. So I'm gonna go back here. So it's just happening in a different part of the brain. And they literally aren't, in how we're taught, and my understanding of this is like, there's no crossover. They're not communicating with each other. So when that self-regulation and emotion area happens in a different part of the brain than the area where the smoke detector is, that's not necessarily a communication pathway. So if we're not processing properly, there's not a way to understand whether that needs to be an emotional thing or not, right? Or that it needs to set us off. So we may drop into emotion when our nervous systems, again, then are on this overwhelm, staying in that fight or flight, sympathetic, then we tend to be more anxious or depressed if it makes us exhausted. Some of you might relate to this if you've seen your HRV scores lately, and you kind of see where you fall on that chart with the circles, the green, yellow, orange, red, right? Is where is our body at and how it's processing our stress and our world. So it can be for some people high or a low. And mostly what it's creating is this disassociation, right? So we drop into the emotion component, and the executive function then of our brain literally drops offline. It's like it's not doing what we need it to do. So how she also describes it is just that we want the autonomic system to really be perceiving what's happening, and yet emotion can't tell time. So I love the way she used this to teach us that it's, again, we have this sympathetic loop. The brain thinks that emotion it's tying it to is in real time. So it can be, it's perceiving a memory or a thought that you're stuck in this emotional state about a thing, but it doesn't have to be that that's what's happening in real time now. Your brain thinks it's real time because it doesn't know the difference. So it's perceiving that thought or that emotion you've got tied to that trauma or that thing that is lingering, right? Or that we're anxious or overwhelmed about into real time now. So it can be a way that we just go into things that are old in nature in a sense, but we haven't processed through them correctly. So they become, feel like a current thing, a current emotion. And we're just pulling off of an old one because the brain doesn't know any different, to take this and separate it from the past experience, if that makes sense. So it's, again, the sympathetic loop that we can't always release, and then it gets stuck in the body. What we then see, and what causes a lot of that downward spiral, is then a dysregulated immune system and nervous system, a very overactive immune system. So someone who can get sick easily, who has a lot of inflammation in the system, because all those things of an overactive immune system means it is on fight or flight mode and it's not able to keep up. So we see inflammation show up. If for people that are stressed, that's cortisol is our stress hormone, right? So you may see your cortisol levels go up. That brings on its own slew of symptoms that come from that, or issues that come from elevated cortisol over long periods of time. So it's just stressing our nervous system and our brains because we're stuck in that pattern. So anything then, as the slightest little challenge, can throw us off or throw us back into that fight or flight, or more unfortunately, get out of that sympathetic and drop into that dorsal shutdown. That is where the brain's not communicating or computing or regulating much at all. It is just completely shutting out of an emotion and just almost being like, well, I don't even know how to react to that. It just doesn't even react to the trauma, the emotion, or that component. So retriggering the experience can make the brain stay stuck in that fight or flight state, and then it only does it for so long. Then it creates it thinking it's in kind of that real time, and it just starts to shut down from just exhaustion, if you will. So trauma unresolved really disrupts the biology of us. It creates an inability for the body to thrive. Exposed trauma really to brain and body is then impacted. And then trauma is is encoded in the body, and we have it as like an emotional recall, if that makes sense. So it makes us like we're reliving something over and over and over again. So it's about getting out of that pattern if we're in it, or recognizing where we are falling in that place of hierarchy and processing, right? And again, knowing that it's coming from the brain first and stemming through that nervous system. So the amazing component is that, of course, we can change this state. And all the work that's being done now is on how to do this from what we would call in a sense, a bottom-up approach versus a top-down approach. So we'll talk about that in a few seconds and kind of wrap up with that. But this is talking about how, again, the body keeps score in a way. And so when it's looking at if it is stressed or it's in a nervous system dysregulation, then fatigue happens, the immune system slows down, we get disassociated from things, we can go through phases of anxiety versus depression, all the things we were just talking about, even so much of like a flashback, because again, in our brain, the emotion component doesn't know that it was an old thing. It comes back up as feeling like it's a new thing, like it has just happened. So trauma unresolved disrupts that ability to thrive, making impacting the body and brain, and really that emotional recall creates reliving the event. So these are three areas that we tend to look at as the three primary modes that your nervous system has. So knowing where you are is really important. And then how we tap into getting back into the I can and the I am area, because it's not like we want to shut part of the nervous system off and then dial up the other part. We have to be functioning in both all the time. So it's not like we want to turn up that, ventral and we want to turn down the sympathetic. You need both of them being in that homeostasis, humming along, jumping in and taking over where they need to, and then the other one dropping back in and taking over where it needs to. So the I am is really, like it shows there, that social engagement, right? It's that freedom, friends, forage. It's that ventral vagal being at its most optimal state of function, and that it can process our world, and it can know where to compartmentalize things, and it cannot recognize that what happened in the past has to be what's happening right now again, and taking you back into that kind of spiral state. So processing through something to where it can stay processed. So they also talk about this work that's being done a ton with addictions, and with components of PTSD and really intense long-term traumas. So there's a component where there's a time and a place for people to start that work and do that with somebody that's licensed to do that work. And we'll talk about that for a second, but that's not something we're going to go into tonight. It's just recognizing where you are and what are those triggers, so you know where it is that maybe the work needs to start from and to be done to help get you out of that dorsal vagal or that sympathetic state. So sympathetic's more of the, it's an aggressive defense system, right? It's that fight or flight. It's coming to our rescue. And yet we needed to do that, and we needed to just do it in short bursts, short periods of time. If we fall past that state, being able to bounce back into engaging that safe place, and we're not in a safe zone with something or a trustful place, then we can drop into the I can't, right? The passive defense system of where it's really that freeze frame of where you almost feel like you cannot make a decision or cannot make a move to get yourself out of that situation. And that can be where a lot of people with long-term traumas sit. So it's about helping support being able to come out of that, process through it, and be able to not drop back into that or frozen state of being. So the I can again, may look more like anger, rage, frustration, or anxiety, fear, panic, worry, right? It's the different parts of being in that fight or flight. What that does, if we sit there too often, which is I'd say where most of our population is when we are doing our evaluations, is we're sitting a little bit more into that stress defense mechanism state. It affects things like our heart rate goes up, our blood pressure is up, our digestive system then goes down, because in a fight or flight state, you're not going out and running a marathon and chomping on a burger at the same time, right? It's like your digestive system is worked by other parts of the system. So that part and your immune system get put aside when you're in that fight or flight mode. So it also changes someone's pain threshold, which was not something I picked up from our first couple trainings with her, that I just didn't, I guess, connect the dots in thinking about someone who, it's not necessarily a healthy thing to say I have a really high pain threshold. There is a nervous system and a brain component to that. And I thought that that was very interesting to hear, because we hear that a lot in the office. And that can also just help tap into where somebody's at in that state. Again, I can't is a very emergent state, but it's also very overwhelming. So insulin is up, pain feels more intense than it might feel in other times of life, and almost more of a stuck state. It's a very primitive pattern. So you just almost feel like you cannot move. It almost takes you back to a very primitive state of before you made decisions as an adult. So when we talk about polyvagal, we're talking about how we can support that calmer part of our nervous system, that healthy part and the ventral part of the nervous system that needs to be being regulated and really needs to be where we function more of the time, and being able to tap into it easily once we come out of a sympathetic or fight or flight state. It's their social engagement system. It's looking at things that like help you, where do you feel safe? Where do you feel mobile, right? So when it's about mobilization, it's and a point of immobilization as far as being healthy, right? We have to rest, we have to recover. It's looking at kind of those blue circles of what's our social engagement system? How are we engaging with other people? How are we engaging in things that make us happy? What types of things are we doing for movement, right? In whatever form that is for you. And how are we slowing down to rest, sleep, meditate, rejuvenate our body, right? Those are the things that are going to help us stay tapped into that part of our nervous system that needs to be helping us run our world and being in the most healthy state possible. So looking at what the vagus nerve looks like, that's the anatomy. I feel like I always like to leave this slide because we like to geek out here with anatomy. It is the longest nerve, one of the longest nerves in the body. So when we talk about your polyvagal, this vagus nerve, chiropractic, and something new that we're throwing in there is just a concept for people to be aware of, this EDMR. It is all ways in which these three things are showing very scientifically proven to be supporting this function of our bodies and our brains and our nervous systems. Chiropractic through the adjustment, why I'm showing the anatomy is showing that that nerve runs right along the vertebral body of your spine, and it goes all the way from the back of your brain before it leaves into your neck, but before it even leaves the skull, down into lower parts of the colon. So we're looking at, it's the longest nerve. It impacts everything along the path. But it's really what gives our mind and body their strong connection. And it plays a huge role in the emotional regulation, the fear response you have, and the social connection that you experience. So when you get adjusted, we are tapping into supporting this part of your world and the support of your body functioning at its highest potential. So it's a huge piece to the work you're putting in with when you get adjusted. It's not just about, is something out of an alignment? Is that creating pain? Do I have a muscle spasm that day? Those are all other smaller, in a sense, side effects to this part of our body not functioning the way it should and the way it can. So one component of supporting your body doing that is through chiropractic care. Neuroplasticity, we talk about a lot in our world, but it's that whatever it is we're doing, whatever path we're taking to work on this, Through the polyvagal work, there's a lot of work to do for the vagus nerve. You can find tons of it. And then we have a couple other workshops where we actually talk you through some of those things. And per where someone's at in the office, we can certainly talk you through breath work, tapping work, movement work that all tap into this polyvagal tone that you can do a couple minutes at a time, a few times a day, and really put attention towards this. So when we're trying to change the brain, whatever facet we use, we have to see how moldable and changeable the brain can be. So it needs attention. It needs focus on a process. It needs the repetition of that. That is why someone who doesn't come in frequent doesn't see long-lasting change of any type. You need a daily practice. So there's things that you can be doing to support this part of your nervous system when you are not in the office, as well as when you are. And that it's doing the thing. You've got to take action, right? We can't just talk about it or read videos about it or watch someone teach us stuff on, on Google about it. We have to do the work. So that's why we set up our care plans the way we do. And that's why we add things in as your body and your brain are processing your world better. If you have primitive reflexes or you have kids or people that are challenged in that way, we have to address that first before we can give them their brain more work to do. But hopefully, if that's something and you're on the call and that's something you're experiencing in your world, in your household, that with anybody from young kids to adulthood, that this could be a piece that's needing to be addressed in order to get you to that end goal and to get you up and over things. So EDMR is not a piece that we're going to address at all tonight, but it's really showing that it's eye movement regulation. And when you do certain activities and movements, it creates a more cohesive, a more a clearer nervous system, a clearer brain in processing. So again, it's working with that plasticity. It is really showing amazing results of people being able to change and transform, getting up and over something. So I guess I would wrap up the concepts of the top-down theory was really that it's temporary helpful, but not long-term beneficial to just be addressing mental areas of illness and or fatigue, depression, anxiety, or those types of components with just like medications, or something that is even what they will call talk therapies, like doing therapy. Talking through something can be really hard for somebody and they don't want to go through that process of dredging it all up. Now, this is not to say not to do any of those things. It's a component of where someone's at and where they need to start to figure out what the things are in their world, in their life, that just may be a component of where they have trauma or past trauma. And instead of re-triggering the problem, trying to redirect the connection point. So it's really working through the body when you do a bottom-up strategy to where you may do small components of those other pieces initially to get to a spot, but seeing the tremendous work that's done through polyvagal work and this EMDR that is an additional component to supporting your brain and nervous system to process through things without necessarily having to relive them. And especially for people with really intense, severe traumas. So if that's a component where there's any of that that resonates for you, then, we are here to support you in obviously your chiropractic care in supporting your brain, and really being able to give you other tools that you can use outside of the office that supports you and your family and your state of being. When there is a couple programs out there that I thought a slide was in here on that and it didn't get saved. So it's information that we can, pass on to you. We can share with you how to do polyvagal work depending on where you're at and what the goal is, and help give you other tools to tap into if doing some of that work to help regulate sounds like something could support your health journey. So sorry, I started a little late finishing up a report. I'm ending a little late, so I'm going to have you get as many questions to us when you come into the office. Shoot us questions in email. That's all something that then we can address or chat with you with either before your next visit or on your next visit, or connect with you to make sure you have the support you need in any way possible in this part of life. So thank you for joining us tonight on Tuesday for how we are healing our brain through our nervous system and our polyvagal. Again, I look forward to hearing your takeaways and questions that you have when we see you in the office.
There is something in the chat.
Yeah, let me